Anytime I'm doing any kind of either professional development or just a learning situation, my brain is always looking for multiple ways to bring that information forth, multiple ways for people to engage with and interact with that information, actively producing something based on that information.
Well, hello and welcome back to the Shifting Schools podcast. I'm your host this week, Tricia Friedman, and on today we are joined by the incredible expert in all things UDL, that's Universal Design for Learning, Dr. Louie Lord Nelson. She happens to be the author of several books that will help you think about UDL in both powerful and practical ways. She's here to talk us through what it means to continue to make sure that we understand the myths, how to get past them when it comes to universal design for learning. And we also think about theater as a metaphor for it. Before we dig into this week's conversation, I want to remind you that coming up this week on June 5th, you can join me for a free 45-minute session that dives into futures literacy. We'll be using futures literacy as a vehicle to start thinking about what the future of professional development is. Again, registration is 100% free, and you'll find that link to sign up at www.shiftingschools.com. Now join me in welcoming to the Shifting Schools podcast, the extraordinary Dr. Louie Lord Nelson. Dr. Nelson, we're starting in kind of a strange place because I interrupted you, our pre-recording conversation, to say, wait, I want to get this on the record. You were talking a little bit about like your, maybe I'll call it your UDL origin story of coming from a technical theater family background. And in my mind, I feel like there's a lot of overlap there between UDL, understanding like, actually, if you tweak this little thing, like something else of the story on stage might come to life. For any of our listeners who are like, what the heck is technical theater? What does that mean? Would you go into that? And then would you either correct me and say, Tricia, you're wrong. That has nothing to do with my current interests. Or hopefully say like, oh yeah, actually, maybe it does connect.
Yeah. Okay. Technical theater, anything that happens around the design of a theater experience that isn't like the actors acting. So lighting, sets, props, stage managing, rigging, which is the curtains and the way those move, and all the electronics, all of those things. And so while my parents were both lifelong educators, and dad retired after 38 years, my mom retired after 25 years, technical theater was the foundational key there and piece behind both of their roles. And then my dad's extended beyond that. He's a consultant too, and still at the age of 94 is a consultant to lots of different architects for specifically rigging and lighting and then some sound stuff. So anyway, where we came into this was because my family, I think through all of that, we love logistics. We love to talk about traffic. We love to talk about like the best route or the best way to move through a space. And I was mentioning that this isn't because we're not talking about another topic. I think some people use that as the safe space because you're not talking about anything that could be potentially dangerous. No, it's our love language. We just connect over this stuff. So I think what's interesting there when I think about universal design for learning, for me, the connection is that absolute design piece. And that's probably why I was drawn to it, because the concept and the truth is, if you're the instructional leader, and I don't care what age you are, if you're the instructional leader, you're designing, you're making the choices of how you want to build rapport with your students, how you want resources to be used and what resources to be used, how you want to move through your curricular decisions. So that design aspect, I think, is probably what the biggest hook was for me when I was coming into UDL. And then I think the other part of it, well, I know that the other part of it is because it is about creating environments where every single learner has the best opportunities to learn and participate and be part of that environment. And that was an instant draw for me. So I think those are the two big pieces about who I am, and then, yeah, what drew me in there.
I'm wondering too, when you're talking about logistics, I feel like logistics in life, this is a thing that we can very easily just kind of fall back onto default mode, not question our thinking. Like, this is the route that I take to go to work. This is the route I always take to go to the store. But actually, when it's a experience, even just with one other person, you start to notice and discuss and tweak. And the same, for anybody that's done anything in the theater, I think it's also, you maybe could easily underestimate what's going on with the lighting design, because that's not a person who's on the stage. But if you've been working in theater, like that is like a star in the story. And when you play around with lighting, it can have a huge impact. I'm thinking too with the route conversation. Once you start taking a different route, you kind of have oh, actually, this is a really nice scenic route. So if I am driving and I want the experience of like co-regulating with somebody, like it might be worth the extra, 5 minutes or whatever. But I also think it's one of those things, if you don't talk about it with somebody or you never just switch it up, it's really hard to understand the impact of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As is true to conversation, I'm going to take what you said and even like go a little bit further and talk about a critical aspect of universal design for learning is intentionality. It's intentional design. So, for example, going back to the conversation about the route, driving the same route, we all know what it's like to drive the same route. And in fact, sometimes we'll get someplace and be like, oh my gosh, I don't know what happened during 3 miles or 4 kilometers or whatever your distance measurement is of that drive. And it happens everywhere in our lives. It's part of the beauty of our brains. We don't want to villainize that. That's what helps us function. But when it comes to design and when it comes to making decisions specifically for the design of our classroom environments, those need to be intentional. So when I'm having conversations with people who are new to UDL or they're exploring UDL, and I want them to see what they're doing that's aligning with UDL, because it's a great way to start. It's a positive way to start. It helps people have that connection with the framework. But soon after that, the conversation has to be, so what was your intention of doing that? So if the intention isn't considered, or the intention wouldn't necessarily always be on our learners, and that's where we have to shift. And we want the intention to be, oh, I'm looking for ways to make sure that all of my learners are included. And belong and are building agency. We keep going from there. So turning back to the analogy and the conversation with the theater and that example of lighting, it's very intentional. We want that person who's speaking or has the critical monologue to have the kind of lighting that the designer then wants the audience to experience. So an unintentional thing would be to have a spotlight. Every time an actor speaks, there'd be a spotlight on them, a spotlight, a spotlight. That would be really disruptive as to the audience members, horribly disruptive, because it wouldn't give us that feel that we want, an experience that we want. So a lighting designer is incredibly intentional about how they design the use of that tool so that the audience has the experience that we're all hoping that they have within that performance.
I also want to point out, listeners, you will have heard Dr. Nelson say learner, 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 not student. And this is, your amazing book, Design and Deliver. You point out the intentionality behind, we are all learners. It's not necessarily like I am studying what you are delivering, but, hopefully we are lifelong learners. And I love that too, because I think whether you are intentional with something or not, people are learning from that. And with the lighting example, I love it too, because it really taps into our emotional register and gets folks thinking about like, what is the mood? What is the tone? What am I supposed to be feeling here? And I think sometimes that is underestimated in classrooms. And I wonder, as someone who, maybe one of our best living experts on UDL, you talk about, know there are barriers, look for barriers. And that has me thinking about like, what have been some of the barriers for UDL? And I think it is the unfortunate reality that so many practitioners work in isolation, don't have the opportunity to see others facilitate. And, this is where in consultancy, I know you partner with other people as I do. And it's brilliant practice because it really forces you to discuss, well, hey, why do you do that way? Or what happens when we move this section over here? And, something that I get a little bit like fussy about is with workshops, I don't like starting with a big, lengthy introduction. Like I do want a spark of curiosity right there, because I feel like in theater, there's a reason that theater doesn't start with, this big, lengthy, blah, 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 blah. It's like, we want you right in the feeling. And that's kind of how I feel about learning. Do you see that as a barrier for UDL practice? I know that, you had one of the very first ever titles of being a UDL coordinator. And I kind of wonder, like, what were some of those biggest barriers to getting people? Because, a listener might be saying, like, this sounds wonderful, but hey, guess what? In theater, there are separate roles, like a teacher is kind of doing, you are the director, the actor, the lighting designer, the custodian all at once. What are some of those things that you think, if we want UDL to really flourish, we have to get over this as a barrier? Does something come to mind? Or many things?
Yeah, many things. So I'll preface this by saying I've never been the person who, when somebody comes to me and says, what's your favorite food, or what's your favorite music, or it's like a showstopper for my brain, because it's not the way I work. I tend to work like spectrum.
Yeah.
So there are a few things here. So I think that, UDL it's really beguiling. And I'll say that because it captures possibility. We all want every learner to be successful. If we didn't enter this field with that desire, well, we don't belong in the field if we don't have that desire. So if anybody's listening to this and you're not automatically thinking, I want every one of my learners to succeed, you might think about a career change. But at the same time, we have this framework that relies heavily on us understanding context and understanding our role in designing that context. I know it's like broken record, but if we aren't ready to stand on that and take ownership of that, then that creates a barrier with universal design for learning. Another barrier that's just right at the ground level, it depends on what your curriculum is. When I say that, what I mean is, are you working with something that is provided to you? It used to be in a box. For those of us old enough to remember, the curriculum used to come in this box, and somewhere in the 90s, you had this nice little magnetic lid that would lift off, and you had the teacher edition in there, and you had a student workbook example in there, and then eventually DVDs came in there, and right. So now we're kind of in digital packaging, but it's all there together. And in some cases, educators are asked to follow that really, really closely and not have a lot of room. And then we have folks who work off of benchmarks or standards, and the expectation is that they're going to pull together their resources. They're going to pull together their their strategies. And they're going to design all of that, right? And so when I'm talking with audiences about UDL, that whole spectrum, they're likely in my audience, if it's a big enough audience. If it's a specific school, then I can get to know what kind of curriculum they have, right? And so when we're asking educators to think about engagement and representation and action and expression, that's always going to be in relationship with that curriculum. And then instantly, they're going to be thinking about how they perceive their ability to make these kinds of shifts within that curriculum. And I have to honor that, and so does anybody else who's working in the UDL community, because that perception drives their application of the framework. So if an educator perceives, for any reason, that they aren't able to change this, that, or the other, then they're likely not going to feel as connected with the framework, because the framework is asking them to, we'll take a literal aspect of, if they're told that they need to do direct instruction for 15 minutes on this particular topic, then when we're making suggestions on how they can represent information differently to their learners, they're going to be like, wait, there's dissonance here. I don't understand how to do this. You're asking me to do this because neuroscience tells me it's a good idea, in psychology and special education and general education, but I've got this that I have to do, right? And so if we're not prepared as UDL leaders to help our educators understand and mitigate that and see where they do have space, or to have conversations to create that space, then it all just kind of falls apart.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's, people do want to be based in reality. And I think, many educators are saying, I know I could do this, in a much better way if I didn't have certain constraints. At the same time, I feel like, as someone who has worked with a curriculum that has been quite restrictive, there are still things that we can do. Just like, I guess, if you're that lighting designer and you don't really love the play, you can still play around and tweak things a little bit. And, you talk about the learning environment includes, yes, your physical space, the resources that are in that space, but also the emotional relationships within that space. And that's what comes to mind for me when I'm thinking of, maybe I have a curriculum that is brutal to work with. does my focus go here? But what are we talking about when we're talking about the emotional relationships within that space? Can you say more on what that means?
Yeah. Yeah. I will say first, I have a good friend, Michael McSheehan. He's brilliant in the field of MTSS and with significant disabilities. But anyway, he has this phrase that he tells people. He's like, your check is in the mail, when they say something that's like right there in a line. So I'm like, yeah, your check is in the mail. Because when we feel like we're limited in any way in the structure of our curriculum, we can always address those emotional connections. There are so many people in the field that have done so many great things around emotions and understanding them. I turn a lot to Lisa Feldman Barrett. If any of your listeners have not read her books, then they need to. But How Emotions Are Made, it's been out several years, almost a decade now. But excellent resource. But we have to remember that, our emotions are what they guide our actions, and they essentially explain what we're feeling in a specific situation. But we aren't born with those, right? We gain them over time. How we just even the conceptualization of emotions happens based on our own growth through life and our own experiences. So when we think about how we use our emotions in the classroom and creating an environment that supports the emotions of our learners, our emotions, and help us build those relationships. I like to think about, so Daniel Goldman and Paul Ekman are two researchers in the field of neuroscience, and they have 3 ways that they talk about empathy. And so there's this cognitive empathy, where that's where we understand where somebody else is coming from. You're like, oh, okay, I get where you're coming from. I can sense your reasoning. Okay. We have emotional empathy, and that's when we have the feeling. It's like we feel what the other person is feeling. Okay. And that can extend to physical sensations. Like if you see somebody trip and fall, and you just kind of that, oh, that hurt. They landed on their knee. Oh my gosh. So when we bring those together, we have this way of relating to others that doesn't overcome us with emotion. We're not overcome with emotion, right? But instead, we're able to support others and take action on their behalf in wise and smart ways. So that's what I think about when we're building an emotionally supportive environment for our learners, and recognizing that that's part of our design. Our intent is not to become overwhelmed with what our learners are experiencing. Because if we did that, right, that's talked about in the field. It was brought out during COVID, right? That huge wear down that can happen. And it definitely happens. But instead, what we're striving for is to have that sense of, I know where you're coming from, and I understand the feelings that you're having. Now I want to make sure that I'm creating an environment where even before you walk into the environment I'm designing, you're going to feel more comfortable. You're going to feel like you belong. You're going to feel the possibility of learning, the possibility of gaining a skill, gaining information about content. Yeah. Gaining experiences. So that's what we're looking for when we're designing. And that's why we use the framework, is to help us construct those spaces.
And maybe I would argue too, like just gaining the chance, I always taught middle and high school, like gaining the opportunity to make a connection with another human, which, becomes increasingly more and more important and is a good thing. And I think about that in conjunction with all of this conversation about the loneliness epidemic and wondering, like, okay, well, how much of our learning is designed and scaffolded for authentic collaboration, not, hey, we're a group because we're sitting around together, each other in desks, but we've also done some learning about understanding why collaboration is difficult, because it's difficult for all of us as well. But I think, Dr. Nelson, what you're also inferring here is an attunement and a noticing and a willingness to notice, like, gosh, I can tell actually people are bored, or, there's confusion, there's disengagement. And I think there can be, and I would say, like, as an early practitioner, an impulse to say, oh, it's like insulting to me, like, how dare they not be engaged? And, sometimes maybe it could be about that, but it isn't always. But can you say a little bit more about what it means to notice what's happening with engagement and recalibrate?
Yeah. I was just talking with somebody else about this earlier this week, because she's been a educator for 25 years, right? And now she's moved into a coaching role within her school district and works with brand new teachers, people who are new to the profession, right? And that piece is so crucial, that you have that ability, the skill, to watch and scan your learners as they're working through the environment, whether or not you're doing direct instruction, whether or not they're working in projects, whether or not they're working in pairs, whatever the scenario is. But you have enough of a connection with your learners as individuals that you're able to move through that space and take in and register where they are in their connections to learning. I also taught middle school and grade 8 all the way. And I love middle school. Oh, I love middle school. And it happens at every grade level, predominantly the older ones, though, where they just know how to deceptively look like they're busy, but they're really not doing any learning. They're not. Oh, the drama of pretending. And so you have to know your learners and get to know them well enough. But even before even like on days 1, 2, and 3, it's understanding how to read them and read the room, and then having the toolbox, having the additional things on your side because you thought about them ahead of time and you were intentional about it. And you're like, this may not go as well as I want it to. So I'm going to need to turn right or left and take this lesson a different direction and get them all back in here again. That's a skill. It's a definite skill that has to be built. But I think that, again, it goes back to what I was just saying, that intentionality, because when you design a lesson, any of us who have been in a classroom more than 1 month know that a lesson can fall apart really quickly. And it doesn't matter how skilled you are. But part of the bringing it back together is that empathetic connection that you have with your learners and building that connection. I think also it goes back to what kind of community you're building within your own classroom. So this isn't just about us and our learners. This is about creating a collaborative community of learners and establishing that there is a reliance in this ecosystem for all of us. I was in a classroom last week. It was a STEM classroom, and the students were at the point where they were building their board games. They'd done all the designing for, a day or two before that. So now they were into actually laying it out and building it. And this was a fully inclusive environment, and meaning that you had students who I think in other school settings would be off in some separate room. But this was a school that said, no, everybody's valued. We're going to figure this out. We're going to figure this out. And so as I was moving around and asking the students different questions about their board games and getting them to chat with me a little bit more, I overheard a student say to another student, well, that was an interesting thing to try. It didn't look like it worked this time. It might work next time. Can we try this? And I thought, what? So when I, caught up with the teacher afterward, I was like, ding, ding, ding. Look what you created in your classroom. That is a collaborative community. That was beautiful, because more often than not, when you're in a later grade classroom, you might hear students say, well, that was dumb, or why'd you try that stupid thing? Right? You can hear that. You can. But I didn't in this environment. Everybody was valued, and the students had the language to value one another. So that tells you that it was worked on, both in that classroom, but in that school community. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. So I think I've gone down a pathway here based on your first question, but here we are.
No, I love that, because, again, I think it is, as you say, like, what becomes possible through UDL. And I know that, I have heard lots of folks say, I hate doing collaborative learning. This class just can't do it. Or these kids don't know how to talk to each other anymore. Like, it's very easy, I think, to fall into that kind of blame or shame game. It is necessary to step back and say, like, what have we done to provide multiple opportunities for engaging with this as a practice? And I think about this at, the adult learner level as well, because there are teams that show, like, we could use a little bit more rehearsal, practice, finding out different modes of collaborating. And ironically, this is, one of the areas that I'm most excited about with AI is you can actually, because, I think people are also sometimes embarrassed to admit what they struggle with when it comes to working with others. Mm-hmm. And, you can use this technology for rehearsal and for trying things out, of course. But it also, I think, really comes back to, are we willing to listen with humility? Yeah. And I think that is just a part of being a good designer of learning that's not easy, but becomes increasingly more accessible, perhaps, when you have other facilitators willing to say, hey, I used to do this. Mm-hmm. I don't anymore because, these are things that have shifted. But I have to say also, something I really appreciate about your work is for anybody who's saying, I want to dig into this more, but I don't have hours and hours and hours. Mm-hmm. Your book, super accessible. You also have quite a lot of free resources online, but you also do a really good job, I think, of, even as somebody who has done so much research, you're able to take that research and make it digestible. It's like science communication really matters. And part of that, I think, is metaphors, stories, and you've compared UDL to a sunset. And I love that. Can you say a little bit more about that comparison? Because again, I think for anybody who might hear UDL or Universal Design for Learning, even as a headline, maybe that's overwhelming. But when you can take it and say, like, think of it like this, mm-hmm. It encourages a start, I think.
Yeah. So I'll ask you, and then listeners can participate too, but think of 2 sunsets that you've seen in your life. Just for a second, think of 2 sunsets.
Got it.
And then my question to you is, were they identical?
No, they were very, very different. And I think that's why they're both so memorable.
Yeah. So what was different about them?
They were in different locations. So one of them that I'm thinking about is a beach sunset. The other one is a mountain sunset. Mm-hmm. The duration, the color was different. And then I would say even like the heat, like the, kind of the feeling of the environment itself was different on my skin.
Yeah. And then were you with different people? Were you on your own?
One on my own, one with people.
And when you think about what you were doing prior to that sunset, like, did you plan to watch one of them and not plan to watch the other? Or how did you enter those situations?
Yes, one of them definitely was like intentional, like this is going to be a beautiful sunset. Let's watch it together. The significance of the day was there. The other one, it was just sort of like a casual, I'm here and the sun is setting, so I might as well stick around and catch the show.
Yeah, yeah. So everything that we've just talked about is context and how context affects the way we even see something. So even the way you saw that sunset was affected by all of those other things going on around you. We know that every day the earth turns, the axis may shift a little bit, right? But we know that the earth turns, which makes the sun set, quote unquote. That it's the same thing. But every single time it's different. And so when this analogy popped to mind for me, it was during a run and I was watching a sunset. And then I happened to think about a sunset that I'd seen the day prior that I thought was equally as just gorgeous, blow your mind, but so different. So the framework, when you look at the language in the framework under the different principles, so those are the 3 columns, we have 9 guidelines, and I think we now have 56 considerations. I should know that, but anyway, we have considerations. That language stays the same, but the context changes. So the context commands how we're using the information in that framework. You're not going to use every single consideration every time you can. It's just not possible. But you are deciding what kind of context you want to build, and then you're also responding to structures that are in place. And I like to use that analogy for people to help them see and view UDL as something, it's really beautiful, like a sunset. And I'm not corny about this. It can be awesome, but it takes getting to know what's inside of that framework, what's inside of those principles, those guidelines, and those checkpoints that then provide you greater possibility to construct a context that's responsive to your learners.
With all of the guidance that you share with the world very generously, for someone who is thinking, okay, I'm in, I want to do more of this learning. This Dr. Nelson person sounds like she really knows what she's talking about, because she does. You've got podcasts, you've got so many different online resources. I know also that you're constantly learning professional development. Does something come to mind for you that you're thinking, like, if you're feeling overwhelmed, but you still really want to start doing this work, talking about this with colleagues, is there a starting point or a resource that comes to mind that you're thinking, like, this is something you can check out? It's not going to take you weeks and weeks. Where would you direct folks?
Yeah, there are a few different choices. So, like you so generously said, I do have a podcast called UDL in 15 minutes. And so there are now 135 episodes. And the purpose of that podcast is for educators to share their experiences with UDL. And if people go to my website, which is udlapproach.com, and they click on podcasts, you just scroll down a little bit and there's a table of episodes. And I intentionally created that because I know in many cases, podcasts that have gone on for a while get lost. Like, people don't go back to former ones. So this is organized by grade level or role. And that way, if someone around the world wants to look at what a grade 6 teacher is maybe thinking about and doing, then they can go to that. Now, I will say that pretty much everything is applicable across K-12 plus and post-secondary, but I know human nature. We like to run with our tribe. And so hence I created that. I will say as people get more and more experienced with UDL, then they tend to listen to other pieces. But I've got everything from superintendents, kindergarten. I'm also very purposeful in attempting to find as many guests as possible from around the world. So I've had guests from Malawi, and I've had guests from Syria, and I've had guests from Canada. I've had guests from, I try not to make this US centric as much as I can. And so with my own work, I've been able to find representatives from all over the world. So that's an easy place to start. That's 15 minutes. And if you like to listen to a podcast at 1.5, then hey, it's less time. I also provide the transcript of the podcast, and then there's a YouTube version if you want to watch some, I call it a photo montage. The list that the guest sends me images, and I put those together for folks. And sometimes if they talk about resources, then those are connected there too. So that's an easy place to start. If you are someone who really needs to understand kind of the background of something before you can get started on it, you just want to understand the roots of this thing. How's this all put together? I have something called the tapestry on my website, and I think that's also under resources. But, and this was created on the back of a napkin at a brewery toward the end of COVID when we were all so excited to go out. And, for a long time, I'd been thinking about, gosh, there's so much underneath this framework. And yeah, I write about it in my book, but people don't have time to consume a book all the time, or that's just not their interest, or whatever, wherever they are. And so the tapestry is a hover over, and you can discover what constructs and concepts, practices are involved behind the framework. And that has an EPUB version also. And then for others who understand or want to explore beyond the principles, guidelines, and checkpoints, because there is more to that framework than what's on that piece of paper, that analogy of the sunset was the precursor to creating what I call the UDL Gears. And I worked to examine literature, both research and gray. And I was specific about looking at stuff outside of the US. And over time, what fell out were the mindsets, the skills, and the practices that are discussed in the literature. And so, yeah, that all goes back to what made sense to me, but I just wanted to see what other people were talking about. And I call them the gears because if you think about a simple machine and you have those cogs that move together, if one of those cogs or tines is missing, then that simple machine will continue to work. It's just not as effective. And so when you have all of the gears moving together, along with the UDL guidelines is considered one of those gears, then I think you're much more likely to be in the zone. The mindsets tend to be the most inspiring part of the gears for folks, because they start to dig into those. And if you're honestly reflective and you start to think about, okay, do I really believe that every learner can learn? How do my behaviors demonstrate that? How does my design demonstrate that I really believe that every learner can learn? Or am I placing some learners in places in my classroom or in learning situations where I'm like, no, I don't think you can do that very well right now. There's a difference between saying, Data is demonstrating that you need some additional support, and I'm going to give you that support because I know you can gain these skills. I know that you're going to take this on and we're going to sail. That's a different mindset versus either I don't know how to teach this learner, and so I'm just going to place them with somebody else, or not, know how to, or not going to investigate that, don't have the time, whatever the reason is. Two, kind of how we structure our environments that really can show whether or not we believe every learner can learn. Are we structuring things so that we are tapping into that learner agency and building that learner agency of every single learner? So there's 14 of them. That's just one of them. So those are three ways that people can do that. The fourth way, which is the doing, it's the doing, which is what I know a lot of people, they're like, I just want to do this. Then you can go to the UDL guidelines. CAST has them online. So udl.guidelines.cast.org. And just click on one of the bulleted items, the considerations. Just click on one of them and see what it talks about. And think about what you're already doing that aligns with that. And then maybe think, oh, well, I could do this in this part of my lesson or in this part of my environment. I'm going to try that for a while. That's the doing of it. And so if people want to do, then start there.
I want to push back on what you said about your book, because I think actually it is very accessible. I would recommend it. I would highly recommend it. The way that it is also structured, very digestible, very, I think, likely to spark conversation. So I would also, I feel like what you said about the book was unfair, Dr. Nelson. So I'm going to, that's going to be my take on it. But I guess I also think with the doing, there is also the experiencing. And, I'm thinking about a lot of the anecdotes you shared in this conversation, and you're a practitioner who's still with younger learners, which is so important. Sometimes, I don't know if this happens to you, but sometimes when people ask, what do you do for work? I don't like using the consultant word because I feel like it's got a little bit of a, not great connotation. And I think some of that is because sometimes professional development is set up in a way that's out of touch with, what's happening in today's classrooms. I know that's not about you, but then there's also kind of a disjointment between the thing I'm talking about and then what we're doing. Like, people also need, I think, to experience it, because that feeling, I think when you're talking about belonging, when you're talking about agency, you can feel it. You can feel when you walk into a space, am I going to be able to ask a question, or am I going to get in trouble if I ask that question? Like, it's something that you can attune to very quickly. I'm wondering if, in closing, you might talk a little bit about, one of the mindsets that you write about is, with learning, there's going to be barriers. Like, what happens when that's our mindset, that we anticipate or expect them? For someone who is fortunate enough to experience the magic and joy of something facilitated by Dr. Nelson, what might they experience that points to, in your design, you anticipated barriers? Does something come to mind for you where you're modeling that?
Yeah. So I guess I'll start with even the podcast. So when I knew I wanted to do a podcast, 15 minutes popped into my brain because it felt digestible. Number two, I knew that I was going to have a transcript with it, but I was going to have an edited transcript. Because number three, I knew that I was going to be placing this into YouTube, and as good as AI, and it's getting better, but forever and ever, if you have AI spell my name, it doesn't ever come out right to date. So to date. maybe that'll improve. But I wanted my podcast to be consumable for everyone. And so while a podcast can be listened to, I have colleagues who are deaf, and I wanted my podcast to be accessible. And so then it made sense to not only have something on YouTube that had the closed captioning, but I thought, well, it just wants to stare at a screen. And then when I was thinking about my guests, I knew I was going to be talking predominantly with classroom teachers. And the majority of the classroom teachers that I've been familiar with over my years of working literally around the world, so not a lot of people like to do this, right? Be on camera. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll see about the creating the photo montage. And is that a perfect design? And I want to touch on that also. Design is never perfect. It's never perfect. It requires a lot of reflection, and we have to know that it's still not going to be absolutely 100%, right? There are still going to be people that listen to UDL in 15 minutes and are like, yeah, it's not what I need. It's okay. It's okay. But I have very purposefully created on-roads so that anybody who wants to access that information can get to it. So it's the same kind of thinking that I bring into anytime I'm doing any kind of either professional development or just a learning situation. Is my brain is always looking for multiple ways to bring that information forth, multiple ways for people to engage with and interact with that information actively, and producing something based on that information. And then most importantly is creating a space where everyone feels that their exploration is honored and celebrated, and that any kind of intake of this information is a joy. I want people to take it in and reflect on it. Everyone comes from their own background knowledge, their own background experiences. So it's why I hesitate to ever say, oh, you've reached a pinnacle of UDL. I just don't. How would you ever do that? We're all too variable.
Yeah. And then the context of the world changes, right? So, I mean, I think that was what I meant, by saying it's also just so important if you're working with educators that, you've been in a classroom recently, because these are different times, and there will continue to be times that are different from now as well. But what you said about, letting go of aspiring to perfect design, that really your check is in the mail, because that can be a huge barrier, right? Like if perfection in anything is the goal, I think you're making your workout much harder for yourself than needs be. But can I reframe that question then? And then really I'll let you go. I've taken a lot of your time. But I'm thinking a lot about even just how, okay, for you, if you're designing something, perfection is not the goal, but you are someone who's done a tremendous amount of scholarship. So I'd be willing to bet you have kind of a design workflow, so to speak. And I'm thinking about this because somebody asked me if I would make a screencast of how I switch between different AI models, like when and where I'm using different ones. What does that look like? And I'm like, that is going to be really boring to watch. Like I will, they were like, no, I really want to see it. Like, could you just see it? Like narrate it, give me one example and I'll watch that. And I was like, wow, okay. And I'm thinking, I bet there are so many folks, myself included, who would love to watch like just your process for design. Is there something that stands out to you that you're thinking, this is always a part of my process? Like, do you have the framework up in your office? I mean, I'm guessing you probably also kind of like have it memorized by now, but what are some of the things that you just do, in your workflow that you're thinking this really lends itself to not designing for perfect, but designing for better?
Right. So I'm a reform type A. which means I'm still a type A, but I have to think about it a lot, right? And so that was a lesson I had to pull in very early on with the framework. So I came into UDL before there was even a graphic organizer. I came in right at the beginning of that. So I've grown up professionally with what's on that paper. You are right that I'm embedded enough within the work that it's in me. However, so for example, I'm putting together a 1-day professional development for next week. And it's at this point, it's what I would call the 90% fully developed. And now is when I go back and I look for my own representations of the principles, guidelines, and considerations. And I do my own analysis of where have I put this in? Where might have I experienced a gap? What do I need to do to ensure that I'm designing this in the broadest way possible? So, of course, with a PD, I'm going to somebody else's space. Typically, well, I shouldn't say typically, but in this case, it happens to be in a conference center. I will have a microphone. They made sure of that, and I'm thankful for that. I'm very picky about that. And I know that we're going to have crescents, so everybody will be facing forward, but they can, they'll be in a curve, so they can talk with one another. 4 to 5 people at a crescent. So those kind of things I can control, but there are other things about that environment, the structural environment, that I can't control, right? And so that's the other reason why I should say that's another thing that I think about very, very purposefully is what am I able to design within that physical environment? What can I not design in that physical environment? Because that then either allows for or prevents physical movement in the room. Like I had to make sure, is there enough room for participants to get up and move around? Because I loathe a PD where I'm expected to sit and sit and sit. It's just so, I always make sure there are opportunities for people to get up and move. But if they so choose and they don't want that opportunity or that doesn't fit for them, then they can stay seated. And here's another thing that I always provide is a way for people to take a brain break. So even if I'm doing direct instruction, or even if they're supposed to be working in groups, if that adult learner needs a brain break, they need a brain break. And I had to teach myself that. I really did. Because if I'm moving through the room and they're taking advantage of a brain break, and in my head, I'm like, ooh, I wish they were really working on this thing right now, then I have to check myself and say, no, I'm providing them agency to make the choice that they need as a learner in that moment. But it's also up to me to develop content that's engaging enough and clear enough and participatory enough that they would lean more toward, okay, I can persevere through this. That's the sustaining persistence, right? So this is the conversation that goes on in my head. And I know that's not a very straight line, but there it is.
I mean, honestly, I think that idea of thinking about the physicality of the space is very important. And I'm like relieved to hear you say that, because sometimes, can you send me a picture of what the space looks like so I can start that planning process? Because you're right. It really can have huge, huge impact on the learning. Dr. Nelson, I could talk to you for hours and hours. Luckily, you are talking to other people for, that in 15-minute blocks on your podcast. So listeners, everything that Dr. Nelson referred to will be over there in the show notes. I think whether you feel well-versed in UDL or brand new to it, what I love about your work is you are really for both ends of that spectrum and everywhere in between as well. And I really want to profusely thank you for being an example of what deep scholarship can look like that values humanity and storytelling. I really, really appreciate that. I think there's so many signals in the world that we need more of that. So thank you so much for coming on the show, talking all things theater and otherwise.
Well, Tricia, I really appreciate it. And I should have at the beginning said, just call me Louie, but I appreciate the honorific. It's very kind.
You earned it. You worked very hard for it. Thanks again.
So much. All right.